I think when I was reading about you, one of the things that sort of struck me was this idea of just fitness, and how people define it.
Yeah.
Like I think of myself as a fit person, but to be honest, after again reading some of your work, I started to wonder about that a little bit because I focus a lot on strength. I focus a lot on cardio. But
Love it.
one of the things that you talk a lot about, though, is mobility. And it
Yeah.
almost seemed like a third pillar. So cardio, strength, mobility. And it made total sense as I was, again, reading your work. So I wonder maybe if we could start with some basic definitions. What is mobility? What does that
I
mean?
love that. So when we started to think critically about how teaching this and the language around it, if you're hearing the word mobility out in the world, you're seeing the fruits of our labor. That what we had was non-specific words like stretching and flexibility. Right. And what you'd say to someone is, do you stretch? And like your coaches were like, did you stretch? You're like, yeah, sure, coach, I stretched.
Yeah.
And like,
you talk to my coach, apparently.
Yeah, sure. So what we found was we didn't have clear definitions of what those things meant. So we tried to use this word mobility. And what we intended were, and I would say, I'll give you two definitions. One is that every physician on the planet, every physical therapist, every chiropractic physician, all agrees about what the body should be able to do. Like your shoulder should be able to go straight up and down. And we should have 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. So putting your arm overhead is flexion. So one of the things we get with stretching per se is that if I just pull on a tissue for a while, I hope it changes and it's going to magically make my back feel better and I'll run faster. That wasn't very specific. So one of the things that we have felt we really wanted to do for a long time was say, how can we know that what we're doing is making a difference? And one of the ways that we found was to say, let's just restore people to their normative ranges. This is the range every physical therapist, again, every physician agrees. This is how much a hip should move into flexion. And one of the things that we then could do is by saying, hey, where and when are we going to have this conversation about, do you have access to your normative ranges? The things that all human beings do. And it turns out that the place to work on those things is in the gym. So if you wait until you have terrible pain, can't occupy your role in your family, can't occupy your role in your community, if your back hurts so bad that you can't go to work, that's a medical emergency. And that conversation looks very different than, hey, I see that your quads are stiff, or when I lay you down on your stomach and I bring your heel towards your butt, you are missing big chunks of your range of motion. And imagine you and I are having a romantic dinner and my elbow stops at 90 degrees. I can't get my hand to my face. You would ask me like, hey, what's wrong with your elbow? And I was like, nothing, it doesn't hurt. I just use long forks. And you would suddenly, you in 2 seconds, you would intuit, I think there's something weird going on. Like your hand should go to your face.
Right.
So what we haven't done is said to people, here is what your body should be able to do in the language of movement. We've said, here's what blood pressure is, and everyone knows that.
Right.
Here's what temperature is, and everyone knows that. And in COVID, we learned that we could have SaO2 and heart rate variability. And like we started to become very sophisticated about understanding some aspects of our physiology, but not range of motion. So when we defined range of motion originally, we just said, hey, you should be able to have access to this range of motion and control this range of motion. And ultimately, the expression of that, because I was in my early 30s, and this was really, I was obsessed with this, was how do I know this made a difference? Because you went faster. You won a world championship. You set a world record. You won the Super Bowl. You won an Olympic gold medal. So when we put people into better positions and gave them access to their native ranges, they threw the ball harder and they could pitch more innings and they could. So what ended up happening is we created this definition of, do you have access to your native range of motion? Can you control it? And when we improve those things, did what matters to you improve? Now, let me give you the definition that I have in my 50s, right? This is a little bit different now. Number one, are you pain-free? Your body should be pain-free. And I think this is really important because I think we want everyone to know that the resting state of the human being is a pain-free state. So the problem is that it's very normal for human beings to experience pain, discomfort. That is, I mean, talk to your children. Everyone, like, knee hurts, back hurts, right? This is a feature. And what we were trying to do is help people reimagine, what does pain mean? By starting by saying pain is a request for change. And what we can do is we can start to begin to treat pain the same way we would lost force production, didn't do my 5K as fast, difficult in yoga today. Wow, spin class was really hard. That's the same level of information that we're trying to get people to be able to address pain. And so, number one, I should be able to be pain-free. And it doesn't mean you'll not have pain your whole life, but we should have a set of tools to help self-soothe, to feel better. And again, we think a lot of that can happen in the home and in a drug-free way. And if we don't have an honest conversation about that, people will reach for ibuprofen, THC, bottles of wine, bourbon, whatever we need to do to self-soothe, because those are the only tools we've ever empowered people. So number one, I want you to be pain-free. And number two, I want you to be able to do with your body what you want, as it relates to your job, as it relates to your recreation, as it relates to being a family member. And that's a much better definition of mobility. And in circling around to what you said earlier, if we were really going to define fitness, I'll grab a definition from Georges Hébert, who was the founder of a French system called Mouvement Naturel around the turn of the century. He said, fitness is the ability to be useful. And that could be useful to your family, useful to your job, useful to yourself. But that's a really excellent definition. And now what we're doing is saying, well, who owns what? And where can we begin these conversations? So it's not just about, I smashed myself on the Peloton bike, I'm excused. And suddenly, if we actually reach into our movement traditions of yoga, of dance, of martial arts, of Pilates, a lot of the cues were there. And in more modern times, we have modern strength and conditioning, which means that we always are running this diagnostic tool. Hey, I had to jump on an airplane. I had an old injury from college. My body changes and is constant adaptation. How do I keep an eye on my minimums? And that's really what we're trying to do with mobility, is how do we help people to understand and make sense of how they move before there's an emergency? And then I have to activate the EMS system.
So just a couple of quick questions about that. The normative range of motion. I think cardio and strength, and I can measure how fast I'm running. I can see how much weight I lift. But when it comes to mobility, I'm in my 50s as well. So would your normative range of motion and mine be the same? Is it changed throughout our lives, different for men and women?
I love that. What a great question. So no, the one thing that doesn't have to change over the whole lifespan is your range of motion. There's no reason. We absolutely are likely to see, if no one ever said, hey, you should put your arms over your head or be able to take a big breath, you might get stiff in your shoulders and upper back. What we don't have to change is our access to our range of motion. And, independent of your race, religion, personal identity, background, turns out you're still a human being. And the only sort of discussions are, should we have 130 degrees of range of motion of the hip inflection, or maybe 125? So you'll see the experts might disagree by a little bit. But when we are missing these big chunks, suddenly what we can do is we can begin to shift this loci of control back to the person. Because this is, and remember, I have a clinical doctorate. I'm very skilled. I work with the best athletes in the world. There's some things that I'm very good at. But most of the things I talk about don't require an advanced degree, in terms of bringing your knee to your chest more often, sitting on the ground. So, for example, one of the ways we want to think about this is, I have a finite amount of time to work on my body. It would be great if I could go to a fantasy, health ranch, and I could have someone massage me every day, and someone makes my meals, and someone does a perfect program. But let me introduce you to having teenagers and working a crazy job. and like, this is all of us. And so one of the things we really try to spend a lot of time is saying, how do we simplify the process so it doesn't feel so overwhelming? I'm not giving a busy working mother another listicle. Here's how you're going to optimize your morning routine. She's just stoked to have a coffee and get her kids out the door with lunch, right? So what we want to be thinking about is, where are the places in my day-to-day life where I have some agency and some control? And one of the things that I'd like everyone to leave here with is, if you begin to sit on the floor in the evening for 20 or 30 minutes, We know you're watching TV. The research bears that out. So all I want you to do is just get off your couch and sit on the floor. And you can sit cross-legged. You can be 90-90. You can side saddle. You can put your legs out in front of you. You can kneel. It doesn't matter. In fact, when you need to fidget, go fidget, change your positions. But what we found is that if we can spend 20 or 30 minutes in the evening touching some of these novel shapes of the tissues, if we took a step back and I said, okay, I'm going to look at all of your movements during the day. What are all the things that Sanjay does during the day? I could create almost like a library of words, of vocabulary words. Hip flexion. I see that you bench pressed. You did some deadlifting. I can see the shapes you are in. Most of us occupy just a few shapes. We just use a few words. We get up out of the bed. We stand up. We walk around. We sit back at the desk. Maybe I do a little Peloton, which again is more sitting and it just, more aggressive sitting. And all of a sudden what we see is we didn't really take our bodies into the shapes and positions that we're capable of. And maybe I go to yoga once a week. That's amazing. But it may not be sufficient to remind my brain to load the tissues. Remember that the human being is an adaptation machine. It's constantly adapting to the environment. And one of the ways that we can begin to shift and expand your movement language is to just start to have some exposure to some of these shapes while we're doing something else. And sitting on the ground turns out to be one of the most profound, game-changing shapes on the planet because you're going to have to get up and down. So that's important. Number one reason we end up in nursing homes is we fail to be able to get up and down independently, right? We can't get up off the ground. So we're practicing that. But we see, again, the things I care about as a coach, right? Working along the best athletes in the world, the Olympics, at the national teams, of all these things, is does it make you go faster? So what we see is that people who sit on the ground, their 5K times get faster.
That's really interesting.
Wattage on the Peloton gets better. Their squats get stronger. Their backs stop hurting. They want to walk more. They want to interact with their neighbors more because their bodies feel better. And it's simply because we're having the body engage in body-like things. And I think that's how we can begin to say, how do we simplify this seemingly complexity in the world? Well, let's begin by sitting on the ground.
I love that. I mean, it's simple, obviously, and I think I understand what you're saying. You're utilizing different, you say language, but using different muscles, different joints and things like that to sit on the ground.
Yes.
And then you have to get up. And that's, by the way, a quick side story. Jimmy Carter, I interviewed him several years ago. It was 2015, I think. Yeah, what a guy. And at the time, I think he was probably in his mid-80s. And I'll never forget, at the end of the interview, he was sitting in a nice chair. And at the end of the interview, he got up out of that chair without putting his hands on the side rests. And I was just kind of blown away by that. And of course, a lot of people, when they get up out of a chair like I am right now, they're kind of giving themselves a little boost with their arms. He didn't do that. And I remember thinking, I hope I'm like that when I'm in my 80s. But you've brought up this notion a couple of times now, Kelly, this correlation between mobility and longevity.
Yeah.
Well, my guess is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that as a society, especially in the developed world, we've probably become less mobile because we're addicted to these devices. We're sitting in these chairs on computers. So it's gotten worse, not better. And yet at the same time, we know that mobility is associated with longevity. So first of all, it's true, right? That we have probably become less mobile. And two,
we can absolutely even just start there, is that we can say, well, what's the number one reason people end up in the ER? Turns out it's falls. What's the number one predictor of death above people 65? A fall. And one of the reasons we're seeing is if I don't have access to balance or range of motion, I can't solve as many movement problems. And losing your balance is a movement problem. Getting up and down and being independent is a movement problem. Being able to rise from a chair while you're holding your baby or your cat or holding a cup of coffee and a book is just a movement problem. So how can we keep as many movement solutions available to the brain as we can? And the stiffer we become, the less access easily that we have of our joints expressed in movement. Not just like, hey, I'm measuring your joint range of motion. That doesn't mean anything. But getting up and down off the ground, not only does it help me create and maintain my movement solutions so that can play and occupy my role in society, I can be independent, I can have less pain. But as you're pointing out, it correlates really well with living well because of all the ancillary benefits that come with it. I'm more likely to garden and be outside and be able to stay connected to my community. I'm more likely to want to be in an exercise class. I'm more likely to be less timorous about riding my bike around Central Park. And the real question is, who and where are we thinking about this? And the answer is we're not. So we like the word, we think longevity is definitely a buzzword right now. We all want to be, we're obsessed with being old and living well. But ultimately, Juliet and I feel like, my wife, and who's my business partner, we feel like durability is the best word. And the reason is we think the hits are going to come. If you're over 50, you're going to, something bad, body's going to throw an error. You're likely to have something bad happen to you. You're not as robust. I mean, you will recall being a teenager, you have teenagers yourself, like you could cut their hand off and the next day it's grown back. I mean, people ask me all the time, would you like to be young again? I was like, no, but I would like to be able to treat my body the way I did when I was young. So what we're really saying is, hey, if I want to have a joint and tendons that act like joints and tendons my whole life, I better use that joint and I better load those tendons. Otherwise, they're not going to be available to me as readily. My brain is not going to have access to that. I'm not going to be able to, my tissues are going to get stiff. And what we know is that in cultures that toilet on the ground and sleep on the ground, fall risk in the elderly approaches zero. In cultures that eat on the ground, sit on the ground, live on the ground, we start to see osteoarthritis in the hips and the knees and the back approach zero. And why is that? Well, it could be that our nutrition is slightly different or how the stress of our lives are different, but it also could be simply that we have to use this range of motion, that we have to squat up and down. We have to just maintain these really simple reference positions of what is it a human being should be able to do? I should be able to rise up and down off the ground. I should be able to sit comfortably. I should kneel. And shouldn't be an accident that then when you did what you say is, hey, my society is giving me a lot of cues and inputs. And I can't come into the board meeting and be the guy sitting on the ground, or I can't go into my child's, teacher meeting and not sit in the chair. It's sort of inappropriate. So what we want to do is say, well, how do we begin to think differently about how we're engaging with our environments? And then we make these small changes, and small hinges open enormous doors.
And by the way, just to get a little granular on sitting on the ground, when you're getting up from the ground, I mean, if you get on all fours and you sort of brace yourself up, is that different than just sort of standing straight up? Does it matter?
Well, the first order of business when we're trying to solve complex human problems is exposure. So let me give you an example. Like, there's a lot of talk about should we only eat organic produce? And I'm like, well, you know what the problem is? Americans don't really eat fruits or vegetables. So before we talk about the quality of the fruits and vegetables we're eating, let's just go ahead and start eating the fruits and vegetables we're not eating. So, right, like if we really want to get ahead and start to change these things, the first thing to do is, like, before we start talking about optimizing and which fat is best for my coffee, let's make sure that we're laying in bed for 8 hours without looking at our phones. But to your point, we're going to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And I want everyone to feel judgment free, because you may not have known this was important. No one ever said that this was important. It wasn't part of your training. It wasn't part of the manual of figuring out how to be a human being. And if you have to get up and down using your hands, that's incredible. And ultimately, we want to give you more movement choices. There was a good piece of research that showed that I should be able to stand, cross my legs, lower myself to the ground, cross-legged, or as the kids say, crisscross applesauce. And I should be able to stand up from that cross-legged position without putting a knee down or a hand down or losing my balance. And that ends up being a really excellent predictor of all-cause mortality and all-cause morbidity. Why? Because it's not about strength. It's about your ability to move your body to solve problems that we know are going to become important to you. Hiking, walking on unstable surfaces, getting up and down off the ground. And again, I know you can do that test because you've practiced it 100,000 times as a young person, but it highlights the fact that, wow, if I got stiff, suddenly I may not be able to solve a problem in space environment. So you're right. that getting up and down the ground using my hands and support, that tells us a little bit about how the system is functioning. And the good news, everyone, muscles and tissues are like obedient dogs. They always adapt. At no age do you stop healing. At no age do you lose the ability to reclaim range of motion. It's going to be a little slower than when you were 15. That's true. But the bottom line is your body is always going to adapt. So let's begin with something really simple.
You and your wife, as you mentioned, Juliet. By the way, that's fantastic that your wife is your business partner and you guys have these same interests, and you wrote a book together.
That's right. That's right.
And one of the things that you talked about in the book was this concept of mobility vital signs.
Yeah.
And you're likening this to you're measuring your blood pressure, your respiratory rate, actual vital signs. How did that come about? How did you start to think about this in terms of vital signs?
Oh, so number one is when we don't always give people clear, objective measures around their body. Sometimes we do.
And that exists though, to be clear. Like if I came to see you, Kelly, the idea that you could objectively tell me what these measures should be for my mobility, that exists.
That exists, absolutely. And you don't need a professional person to help you understand how your body moves. There are so many good, quick self-tests. And what's nice about being able to quickly ascertain is we start to see how your environment, choices, exercise, play, recreation, how it begins to change your body. So if you like to ride a bike, that's fantastic. We like to ride our bikes. But if you're doing a bunch of bike riding, I bet we're going to see that your hip extension, your ability to get your knee behind your butt starts to change a little bit. But if we can keep an eye on some minimums. So for example, everyone can understand that 120/80 is not heroic blood pressure. It's a sign where we start to say, hey, maybe 130/90, 120/80, we start to pay attention to this. Maybe we need to make a little small change in our environment and our behaviors so that we can stay in this reference range. And what we found was that we hadn't done that for how the body moves in space. And we certainly hadn't done it in the language of mere mortals. I can always go see a physician, orthopedist, but there's not one handy in my house. So how can I begin to understand my range of motion? How can my children begin to understand their minimum range of motion? And then what are the simple tools to help me just keep an eye on it? And it turns out a ball and a roller, some simple isometrics, things, 10 minutes of sitting on the ground in front of my television is probably honestly what I need minimum 5 or 6 days a week, 10 minutes. And what we found is that people did that. They would sleep better. Their bodies felt better. And it's demystified this pain experience because suddenly people had some agency. We shifted the loci of control back to the household. You know, if you think about how the system is set up right now, and again, no shade, my father's a physician, my grandfather's a physician, but ultimately, if something is hurting and I can't solve it, I have to take a day off from work or a half day, and I have to go see this physician who doesn't really have, she or he doesn't have a lot of time to really understand how I move and live. They've got 8 minutes to sort of make a quick diagnosis. Then I have to go see a physical therapist potentially who also, maybe I take 2 weeks. You see that the system isn't really set up to help understand who you are, what the demands of your body are, how and when we're going to do these things on top of your crazy busy life. And what we found was, boy, if we just gave people some better tools in the context of their living room, home, we were democratizing self-care. The same way we all think we all should probably eat fruits and vegetables and some quality protein, and we should get some sunshine and we should play. We just want to objectively measure those things a little bit so that we can begin to say, oh, wow, I haven't done this for a while. Or, hey, my knee hurts. I look at how stiff my quads are, and it turns out I found a problem, and that's something I can change.
Everyone should read the book. I think it's one of those things that probably should just be there, right, as a manual for your life next to The Joy of Cooking, a finance book, whatever it might be. But you mentioned the first vital sign, which is being able to get up. Sit on the ground, being able to get up and down from the ground, which I think is great. Second one, I'll just mention a few of these. Maybe we can talk about a couple of them. Breathing, just how long can you hold your breath? Which again, there's objective measures of this. You can count how long you can hold your breath, but there's normative standards as well.
That's right. And one of the things, remember that we wrote this book coming out of COVID. And what we saw was we had changes. People were having all these respiratory issues. And what we saw was that we don't really look at breathing as a capacity and a native experience for everyone. We just take it for granted. The first movement of the spine is the breath. That's the first thing that the body does, is it takes this breath. The rib cage needs to expand, the belly distends, right? And what we see oftentimes is we fail to appreciate how the environment is impacting my ability to ventilate effortlessly. So it's easy to understand that when we're working in the Tour de France, one of the things we work on with our elite cyclists is being able to ventilate more effectively. How do we reduce the session cost of taking these big, powerful breaths? How do I make the trunk more pliable? How do I make it more compliant? How do I reduce that cost? Then when we apply those lessons back to all of us, what we'll see is that we can really affect brain state by quickly changing and being a little bit aware. Like, probably people have heard that when you're not working or working really hard, you should probably be able to breathe through your nose most of the time, right? We want to do most of our breathing through nose in, nose out. And one of the reasons we do that is that we get better function. Suddenly, if I take a nose breath, my diaphragm is recruited. If I breathe through my mouth, I don't really use my diaphragm. I end up using my neck musculature. And the neck musculature, for example, is the musculature I want to use when I'm being chased by a bear. I want to turn on all the power ventilation. It tells me it's a threat. But if I'm using my neck all the time to ventilate because I can't access my diaphragm or I'm sitting in a chair, well, suddenly my brain says, well, we must be in a threat state all the time. And we have really ineffective breathing. So you're going to walk up those stairs and feel out of breath, even though you're not. And then the impacts it potentially has on our anxiety, our abilities to regulate is really profound. And what's cool is that I'm pretty sure modern people are not the first people to ever think about breathing. I'm pretty sure it's a cornerstone of the yogic traditions, Pilates traditions. People have been doing this for a long time, but by tapping into the objective work of our brothers and sisters out there, we were realizing that, hey, we should probably put this as a vital sign because it has so many possibilities to upregulate function.
Right. No, there's 10 of these vital signs, and I'm just going to tick through a few of them. The next one is one that I got to tell you, Kelly, I have trouble with, hip mobilization. And it's interesting. I remember I like to do triathlons. And I remember getting done with a triathlon and just being kind of pretty racked at the end of this thing.
Yes.
Way more racked
as
than
you should be if you're racing appropriately.
Yeah, but I was just like, God, I mean, this is not fun. And I feel, and I went to go see a physical therapist who was near the finish line, and right away it was all about my hips and the hip mobilization. So you've listed that sort of as a third vital sign. Why is it so important, and what could someone like me do about it?
Yeah. Well, we fortunately have already talked a little bit about one of my favorite interventions, which is sitting on the ground.
And which is your first vital sign as well, right? So these they're related.
Yeah, absolutely. We have some simple drills that are, again, we can be as complex and sophisticated as you want. When I'm working with the FBI, the CIA, the Navy, the Army, we can be very, very nuance, and we have kind of a different set of tools for our elite athletes. But for the average of us, most of the time, just my body in a space can begin really simple ways of restoring my native range, of getting non-threatening input in the body. So looking at how your knee comes to your chest is one of those key pieces. And one of the reasons we started with the sit and rise test is that in order to stand up from a seated position, a cross-legged position, you have to lean forward to shift your center of mass over your feet. So you're sitting cross-legged, but if your hips are stiff and you can't bring your knee to your chest or your chest to your knee, that becomes impossible. It becomes an impossible test. So all we're doing is putting the body into a position that requires more normative, not even full range, just some baseline range of motion to express that hip range of motion. And the reason we love that test is that it's one of the first times where people confront the fact that their hips are stiff, because you were able to do a triathlon and still kick butt but you didn't even need to have full range of motion. But what you experienced is that you paid a very high session cost. You had to pay a price for this is inefficiency. So imagine you're driving your car with your handbrake on. Look, cars, human beings aren't cars, I get it. But if I just click that handbrake on one notch, there's sort of a drag on the system. You're not going to get good fuel economy. Your brakes get a little hot sometimes. It's not a high performance machine. So all we're trying to do is say, let's take the brakes off by restoring. And this knee to chest is a really simple way to do that.
I'm going to do it right after this podcast. I'm going to self-assess, Kelly, and
I love it.
I'll call you and let you know how it goes. Another chapter in the book is called "Future-Proof Your Neck and Your Shoulders." And again, we talked about the fact that so many of us are on devices and staring at computer screens way too much. What's an easy way for listeners to sort of assess if they're starting to get into the danger zone with regard to that?
Well, let's start by saying, not necessarily danger zone. You could have terrible shoulder range of motion, not be able to take a full breath, and you may never have neck pain. But likely is your tolerances for silliness start to go a little bit down, right? And then you've been in front of your computer all day long, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, your neck is a little bit sore. And again, I think most of us are like, my neck's a little bit sore. Let me reach for that glass of wine or that ibuprofen because I don't have time for that right now. So what we can do instead is start to say, hey, what is it I'm supposed to do? And notice that we already talked about one of the most important interventions for neck pain, which is breathing. So if we restore your ability to ventilate, to take a massive breath, what you're going to see is that your rib cage, your thoracic spine, ends up being a really important chassis off of which your neck and head function. And so if I'm a little bit stiff in my upper back, or I can't extend because I don't have to, I just kind of sit in a shrimp-like position all day long, and I'm never putting my arms over my head or doing a back bend or leaning backwards or rolling on a roller, or I'm not asked to put my arms over my head functionally like I'm a swimmer or do downward dog. And by the way, I wonder why the yogis are so obsessed with downward dog, because they know that having an upper back and a shoulder that works together is how we have pain-free necks. So what we start to do is start to say, hey, let's not wait until it's always an emergency. Let's always point positive. And we have some simple tests in here around some range of motion of your thoracic spine, laying on a ball, putting your arm over your head, taking some big breaths, keeping an eye on a couple key pieces of range of motion here. And if you follow our bigger work, we have another book that was over 10 years old that there's like 1 million copies of it in the world called Becoming a Supple Leopard. And we speak into what we call archetypes, which are sort of the root positions of the body. And the shoulder does a lot of complex things, but it really only does 4 things. My arm goes up over my head. My arm comes up in front of me. It goes out to the side, and it goes behind me. What gets complicated is that it rotates while it does those things, and then the elbow can bend or straighten. But ultimately, whether my shoulder is rotating or my elbow is bent or straight, those root positions of the shoulder really talk about allowing me to solve as many complicated problems. I can throw a pitch in the major league. I can throw a football. I can kick, right? I can run. I can do chaturanga. And what we start to see is, in our traditional movement traditions, classic strength and conditioning, yoga, Pilates, we program to those shapes all the time. You'll see that fundamentally movement systems have identified these shapes as crucial to function of the human being in a pain-free, high-performance way. So what ends up happening is that if I'm not engaged in one of these systems, then I can end up be missing some of these key ranges of motion. And oftentimes, it's the neck that pays the price for this, for that mouth open chest breathing, for missing internal rotation of the shoulder, of not being able to put my arm over my head. And now if we want to get to the bottom of, those rotator cuff tears or solving that shoulder pain, we really want to make sure we're talking about the functionality of the system. So we start to see the neck, the shoulder, and the upper back as a really simple system. And if we want to improve one aspect of the system, we look at other aspects of that system. So for example, if you're sitting here with me and you're listening to this and I'm slouching, if I turn my head to the right, I may not be able to rotate as far. Now watch this. Get into a position where you can take a big breath. So you and I are both going to adopt slightly different organizations. I didn't tell you what to do with your head or your shoulders. I said, get into a position where you take a bigger breath. And if you rotate now from that position, you'll see that you can rotate a lot further. And that hints at the fact that when we're in better sort of organized sort of geometries, better structures that hint at more function, we get more function back. And when we restore people's function, we oftentimes knock pain out because we're not overusing tissues, we're misusing tissues. Suddenly you don't have to work as hard to do the same thing, or you have better function, which gives me better blood flow and better activity. And the brain goes, oh yeah, look at all these movement solutions. So that's why we're just trying to help people work through some of these simple vital signs, because what you realize is, wow, there's a lot of things I can do to make myself feel better.
Have you ever wondered if we have this sort of native way that we should carry ourselves, this native way that we should be mobile, that we should sit if we are sitting or standing, why do we lapse into these sort of bad habits, would you say? Because it is quite normal to, if I look around the office, to see a lot of people slouching, or even if they're walking and standing, they're sort of head forward, Is it just because of the technologies is that what's doing it to us? Why do we evolve this way?
I tell you what, we wrote another book called Born to Run. Oh, no, not Born to Run. Oh, Ready to Run.
Ready to Run.
It's a playoff on our friend Chris McDougall's book.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we wanted to say is, like, running is a natural normative skill that every human being should run. I don't need to run for fitness, don't get me wrong, but you should be able to run. And all children run. But what we noticed with our kids was that halfway through the first grade, the cohort split. And we had all these beautiful runners. Everyone runs the same in kindergarten. They all, they're little Usain Bolts. They run on their foot. They lean forward. They have powerful hip extension. They land on the ball of the foot. And then halfway through the first grade, some of those kids start to do heel striking. They fundamentally alter their primary locomotive pattern. So instead of sprinting now, they're putting their foot out in front of them and heel striking. And they're in these crazy shoes. And it's crazy. That's like halfway through the first grade, we switch from riding right-handed to left-handed. That's what the equivalent is. Like, hey, we have this skill we've been developing for 6 years, and now let's throw that skill away and change it. We have to ask, what has changed for this child? And the only answer is they're now engaged in more chronic sitting at desk behaviors. So their bodies have started to adapt. So when we see people our age at the peak of their powers and they're working hard, what we see is their body tells a story of their movement history, of their environments. And there's a reason that when you run into a gymnast, you're like, oh yeah, you're a gymnast. I can tell, right? You were a dancer. What is it about that? Well, part of that experience of being able to do those things is that we had to practice a certain carriage and organization that turns out to transfer really well to these pieces. And part of the training is how to organize yourself in gravity and space. And ultimately, the first force on the body that we engage with is this gravity. How do I negotiate gravity? And there are positions that are just less effective at managing gravity. If you look at, if we go into Tanzania or Kenya and you see the indigenous women carrying huge loads on their heads, enormous loads, backs are ramrod straight, shoulders are organized, their disc height is gorgeous because they've been loading their spines for decades. And what we see is, well, the environment asks us to adapt to it. And so what we need to do as modern humans now is say, hey, maybe I have to think differently a little bit, or I have to sort of manage this adaptation response to the environment. And that might just be by sitting on the ground or hanging from a pull-up bar, which is one of my absolute favorite interventions. You want to change your posture, start to put a pull-up bar in your house, start to hang on something, go to the park, spend 3 minutes hanging. You can have your feet on the ground and you will be a different human being in a year.
Wow. Even with your feet on the ground, just hanging from
Yes.
What is it? Just it's I guess addressing many of the things that you're talking about with these vital signs.
Yes. And doing so in a play movement position. Right? You can do downward dog too. 3 minutes of downward dog a day will get you. But what you'll see is that I don't even have to be skilled. I can just put my arms up and just let gravity take over. And you'll start to see changes in your shoulder, changes in your upper back, your ability to rotate, your ability to take a big breath. All of those things will change. And maybe some of you need 4 minutes a day and some of you only need 1 minute a day. But the idea is, how do I begin to integrate these fundamental skills? And there's a reason that monkey bars are part of childhood development, I think. I think we knew intuitively that kids who swung from trees and climbed were just better kids.
This is far more fascinating than I even expected it to be. And I expected it to be fascinating because, look, I as you started off the podcast by saying, we know it's important to stretch, right? But people don't always do it. This isn't stretching necessarily. This is far more, it's more sophisticated, but also I feel more easy to integrate into your life. Sitting on the ground, hanging from monkey bars, really understanding your breath, breathing in through your nose, using your mouth only if you're being chased by a tiger, whatever it might be. These vital signs, some of the other ones, obviously hip mobility, squats, which is something that I do, balancing on one leg, hours of sleep, all these things fundamental, but related to mobility, which is related to longevity, probably related to being less likely to develop pain in your life, less likely to fall. I love this. Will you come back? Because what I'm gonna do is I'm going to spend some real time putting into practice some of the things that you've talked about today. And I'd love to give you a report and just get some feedback.
I love it. And I want to get beyond pain, no pain. I want to know how you swam faster, how you dusted that kid, that young 17-year-old kid at the gym. I want to know how you crushed him. And ultimately, we feel like if we can improve the health of the household, we don't need to worry necessarily about some of the things that the universe is telling us to worry about. We are robust, incredible humans. And the magic is being able to spend time with our friends and family, with our neighbors, and walking, playing. These are the ways of how we transform our communities and society.
I mean, that's the ultimate measure, I think, right? Like you said. But the human body is so remarkable. And I sometimes think people buy these really fancy SUVs that are all tricked out, and all they do is drive their kids to school a couple miles and back. They never really put it to the test. And some of the things that you're talking about allows our human bodies to be put to the test and to show off a little bit in terms of what we can do, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and also enjoy the fact that human intelligence creates things like croissants. And, you don't have to have this austere life to have an extraordinary life. But when we start to cover some of the base principles, it's pretty remarkable about how much more tolerance you have for joy, fun, and again, you'll see in the book where we really try to be additive. And one of the things that I would say that we're most proud of is we've really figured out through my doctoral work was looking at barriers to adherence. But ultimately in the book, you'll see that we're going to give you a template how you can work it into your busy, crazy life without having to give something else up. And I think that's the magic.
What a pleasure, Kelly. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Likewise, everyone knows we are such major fans, and it's such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much.
Give my best to Juliet as well.
Done.
Okay.